Hello, I'm Jimmy Klein. I'm the Director of Enforcement. Some of you know we've been very committed in enhancing our self-logging program to provide a better experience for our stakeholders. We'll go and introduce our presenters, both of which are managers at WECC. We have Michael Dalebout, Manager of Enforcement Operations, and Sandra Revnall, Manager of Entity Monitoring. And they will explain how the self-logging program is a streamlined oversight of minimal risk issues, but also how it could potential impact of other risk-based CMAP components through positive performance. So Michael, Sandra.
The green button. Okay. The new clicker. Thank you for having me. Good to be back in the room with everybody. I'm Michael Dalebout. I'm the Manager of Enforcement Operations here at WECC. I've been with WECC coming up on, I think, 15 years or so now. So you've probably seen me here before, if you've been here before. So today we're going to talk about learn how the self-logging program works, including what factors of impact eligibility, how a candidate's application gets reviewed. We're going to talk about how non-compliance is reviewed for approved entities once you're in the self-logging program. A little bit about qualifying for and participating in self-logging and demonstrates the maturity of your program and could benefit your overall CMEP experience then participating in the program, how it streamlines your overall oversight of minimal risk issues. Oh, sorry, one too far. So, here, sorry, I missed the agenda. I don't know. Let me see if I can go back. There we go. We're going to briefly do the overview, talk about the purpose of the program, go over some self-logging myths, the value of the program to you so that you can have that and take it back and share it, how the program has been integrated as part of the evolution of the program, and then the processes we use to actually put things through self-logging. So when you leave here today, you'll have a better understanding of what this all means and how it works. So if you were here last year at the fall workshop and you're elbowing the person next to you and saying, they just covered this last year, I was here, it's a different presentation. I remember because I was here and I gave that one. So I made sure it's different. So don't leave just yet, it is different. So you will see there what we were talking about last year when we got together. We were considering changes to the program at that time. And we were going to do a program pilot and see how that went. Very clearly, we would tie things into the group, make those low inherent risk determinations and try some of those things. Some of the things worked out, some of them didn't. I'm here to share what we went forward with. So the one thing that I do want to start with and just remind everyone as we're getting going, when we say evolution, it's not a revolution, it's an evolution. We're getting closer to what the documents are saying we were supposed to do in the first place. So we are not going beyond, and the reason I'm showing you these three documents is they are still the hallmarks of and the guidelines on what we do. They are all still 100% accurate, and everything I'm telling you today or everything we're doing with the program is completely within the boundaries of these documents and programs. So nothing new there. Maybe some of these will be updated to reflect, what we just talked about, moving from our old systems into a line. But other than that, the bones of the program hasn't changed. So right in the beginning of the 2014 document, it says what the purpose of the self-logging or the end state is supposed to be for the enforcement program. So the end state for the enforcement program involves reserving the enforcement process for those issues that pose a serious or substantial risk to the reliability of the bulk power system. That's the first line of that document. So with that in mind, we tie that together with WECC's mission, with the end state for the enforcement program, and our mission for us in the enforcement department is to make sure that WECC's self-logging program is designed to effectively and efficiently mitigate minimal risk to the reliability and security of the BPS, reserving the enforcement process for those issues that pose a serious or substantial risk to reliability. So this is really going in on the risk-based approach. So some of the myths about self-logging that I wanted to kind of clear up, not that there was misperceptions, but just to make sure that we're clear. The self-logging program, when you apply for it, used to be pretty resource intensive. It's not anymore. It used to be 5 or 6, maybe even 7 pages long. That was part of the evolution. We don't ask for that anymore. It's just a few questions. In fact, I talked to someone at dinner last night. They said, I'm thinking about putting in an application. When I woke up this morning, there it was. So it can be that close from time of thinking about it to putting it in. Everything should be reported out of abundance of caution. That's a myth. What the purpose of this is that you engage your internal control programs to assess whether it's a violation or not, and then you report it to us. So if you're in that kind of stance, it's like, hey, we're not sure, let's just ask WECC every single time we have a question. That's not the direction we want to go with the self-logging. So the self-logging is not tell us even more that you don't need to tell us. It's to make sure that you've engaged your controls and have addressed that risk minimally and locally. Entities should hold self-logs non-compliance for periodic filing. This is another change we've made since going to the aligned system. It used to be that we'd put you on an either 3 or 6 month interval, and then you'd wait and submit those all at once. So in fact, sometimes it'd be harder on your end because you'd find the non-compliance and you'd say, okay, I'll put that in the corner of my desk and put it in the quarterly filing at the end of the quarter. Not do that anymore. Now it goes straight into the system. At the time you discover it or the time you want to report it, goes straight in. So there's no quarterly logs anymore. Partial details are acceptable for self-log non-compliance. This is a myth. This is, if there's one that I really want you to carry out with you today, the self-logging process is not a lesser process than this, or sorry, yeah, self-logging is not lesser process or a lesser review necessarily than the self-reporting process. So I'll get into more on that in a second. Mitigating to the apparent cause is sufficient for self-logging. That is also not true. We want you to mitigate to the root cause, not the apparent cause, because we want it to not come up again. You want it to not come up again. So, you know, mitigating with the apparent cause really just gets us to remediation, doesn't get us to mitigation. Root cause analysis is not required. Well, for the same reason we just mentioned, root cause analysis is absolutely required. And if you don't have that, then we don't go forward. And then finally, a complete extent of condition is not required. Oh, of course it is. Like, you really wouldn't fix the problem. We wouldn't have any assurance if you didn't do an extent of condition. So that would be a matter of silliness at that point. So what this process looks like from start to finish is you enter a self-log non-compliant submittal. I'll get into this in a sec, but it's essentially identical to the self-reporting process. It goes through a different kind of review on our side, which I'll explain a little bit later, but we actually give it a little lighter review. And then we look into the NERC compliance exception review process. So everything that we complete, whether it came through self-logs, self-certification, if it's determined to be a minimal risk compliance exception, it gets the same review process from us and from NERC on the other end. So even though it started out as self-logging, once it gets into that review process, it has to have something, it has to have what everything else has. And then it goes to FERC. FERC is going to put it through a very similar review. They're going to look for the same facts and circumstances to make sure that it's complete. So who's eligible for self-logging, or what is eligible for self-logging? Non-compliance posing a minimal risk to the reliability of the BPS. Can't be moderate, can't be serious. Those are automatic outs. So kick it right out. It's got to be minimal. That's all the program applies to. Self-logging may be granted for a limited set of standards based on the risk posed by the registered entity and the strength and maturity of its each area. So you could apply for self-logging and only get it for one standard, or just O&P, or just SIP, depending on the maturity of your program. So it's not an all or nothing proposition. So if you're thinking, maybe we won't apply because we won't get the whole thing, where it works, you can be approved for. Restrictions are determined during the candidate evaluation process. So we'll make those determinations of what you can and can't self-log based on history. What's ineligible for self-logging? Compliance posing a moderate or greater risk. That's consistent with what I just told you. It has to be minimal risk. So anything higher than that, it's out. Loss of load, that would not be able to be self-logged. Instability of the BPS, uncontrolled separation, of course, cascading blackouts, vegetation contacts causing extended outages, systematic or significant performance failures, intentional or willful acts of omission, and gross negligence or other misconduct, as you would expect, I hope, but those are not included in this. And if you go back to those 3 documents I showed at the beginning, these are specifically listed as things you can't do. So this is not just our preference, this is written straight into the program. So to talk about how this program benefits everyone, think of it as like a TSA pre. So just a show of hands, how many of you are TSA pre? Quite a few of you, because you know some of the benefits, and you know what you did to get into the program was you subjected yourself to more screening than usual by filling out an application, maybe even having an interview with a TSA pre-agent. They made sure they looked into your history, made sure you weren't a felon, did all these things, and they said, yes, we'll accept you into the TSA pre-program. Right now, there's now 13 million Americans in the TSA pre-program. And if you know what it does not allow you to avoid any of the rules of airports or Transportation Security Administration. You can't bring a machete in simply because you're TSA pre. Like, don't worry about it, I'm TSA pre. I'm not a threat to anyone here. Like, the rules don't change. We just look at you from a risk standpoint a little bit differently, and you move through the airport a little bit quicker. Maybe there's a little bit of a smugness factor of walking around and seeing the people in the longer lines, but that wouldn't necessarily be the case here. Maybe at this workshop you get away with it, but nowhere else would it have that kind of social value. But it speeds up your time in the airport. And again, it's not that you can bring anything through the security that anyone else is, and it's not that you're not going to get screened if you bring something in that's not supposed to be in there. You pack a water down in your bag, try to slip that through the TSA pre, they're still going to pull you aside and look through your bag and pull the water out. It does not give you any additional privileges in that sense. But the point is that you've gone through an additional screening. The Transportation Security Administration looked at you, made a risk determination that you had the skills, the experience, or the lack of a criminal record, or whatever the case may be, that you could be admitted into the program, and you go through a little bit faster. So in terms of our program, how much faster? Well, the self-log CEs in the last 2 years have typically come out in 4 months. Compare that to other CEs that came through other methods taking about 14 months, FFTs 31 months sometimes, and then settlements have often take almost 4 years sometimes. So the difference in how they come in and what makes them complete makes a big difference in the speed and our readiness to move them on. So how does it actually work? So when you submit a regular non-compliance, and what I mean by that is something that's not self-log. So however it comes through, whether it be an audit finding, a self-certification, self-reported, however you send it to us, whether the method of discovery, we subject it to an enforcement review. That's a lawyer and an attorney looking at it together usually. And they'll say, hey, let's look at these circumstances. We fill out case notes on our sides. We do analysis. We look at your evidence. We look at the story. We look at your root cause. We may issue an RFI. Probably many of you have been through that experience. You know what that review is. If at the end of that we determine it's a compliance exception, then so be it. It can be a compliance exception. Or it can be an FFT or a settlement or something else that goes to the right there, as you see. It could be a formal enforcement action that goes on your compliance record. If it comes in as a self-log non-compliance and you've been approved for the program, there's a presumption that everything you put on the self-log will wind up as a CE. That doesn't have to turn out that way because, again, if you put that water container down inside your backpack and we see it and we say, oh no, or you think you forgot what that list of things is and you're like, hey, we had a cascading blackout, so I'm just going to go ahead and self-log that, we'd kick that out too. So those would go up in that dotted line and be like, yep, that's not going to make it through the self-log. That'll get a full enforcement review. But there's a possibility that it just goes, well, I shouldn't say a possibility. There's a presumption in most cases that it just becomes a compliance exception. So that's another benefit of the program. The benefits to us, because there's something in this for us too. Increased visibility into the non-compliance detected and corrected at the registered entity. So we're really good about this, like we like this, because if we see the pattern of everything that's coming in on the log, tells us you're on top of it, we can go back and see what steps you took with internal controls. We think that's a good thing. So the more on there, it's not a problem. It's a good thing. You're recording things, you're fixing them, you're addressing them. We like to see that. Fosters efficiency and minimal risk compliance handling. If you give us everything we need on the self-log, and I don't have to have someone on my staff spend an extraordinary amount of time going through it or asking you follow-up questions, that saves us time. And so if you've gone through the self-logging and been admitted, it generally tells us you have the sophistication that you're putting these things in and give us the details we need. And we will give you training to enhance that as well. improved noncompliance risk analysis. If you've been through the review process, you'll know, and Sandra will kind of share what that looks like in a second. You'll understand why we know this as a result of the candidate evaluation. And then there's a reward for good performance on the part of the registered entity for us, like we can give that to you. And then it's the ideal forum for trend spotting, whether it's, so if we see 6 or 7 entities report the exact same thing on the self-log, we can trigger like, hey, this is some kind of opportunity for education, or should we look at the standard? What's going on here? Is this something we need to be worried about system-wide? So this is where I'll turn it over to Sandra, but as I mentioned, self-logging applications at the beginning are real easy now. It's just usually your name, your field, what your entity does, and go ahead and submit it. That goes through a self-logging candidate evaluation. And to describe what that process looks like, I'm going to turn it over to Sandra Remmel.
Hi, good morning, or maybe it's afternoon. I'm not sure. I am aware that we are what is standing between you and lunch, though, so I just want to let you know that that's in my mind. So what you're seeing here is a relatively simplistic depiction of different areas of CMEP components interacting with the self-logging application. But I do want to unbox that a little bit. So with this one CMEP mindset, from the outside looking in, CME components should clearly support each other. So back in, I think it was March, we started talking more about how can we better utilize the self-logging program, and how does that application process look as we move forward? And we discussed it last fall, but we wanted to continue to move forward and push forward for the sake of, timeliness, efficiency, that type of thing. So when Michael and I were talking, we came to the point that it's been an enforcement-centric process, right? And so we wanted to include other teams, other areas of expertise to help us move through evaluation of an entity should they apply. The actual review of the logs themselves are still relatively enforcement-centric. But then also on the back end, periodic performance reviews and developing revocation criteria. So there's a pretty big process as a whole, and we wanted to make sure that it wasn't simply enforcement-centric. I can go to the next slide. Okay, so when an entity submits an application, as Michael had mentioned, it's relatively simplistic. It's information about your entity. It's generally 3 questions. And one of the objectives of this new application process was to utilize the information we already have available to us about your entity. And we have quite a lot of information. So in submitting an application, if we can go and look at that history, whether it be monitoring history and enforcement history, information we have about your internal controls, whether they came in through an audit or they landed back in your COP, we're going to look at all of that. And we have a lot of metrics to support that as well. So as we move through this, there's the 3 questions, you submit it through, and we have different methodologies that came out of the Reliability Assurance Initiative, and those are to identify and assess, I'm sorry, let me see here. So as we move through, we also have 6 criteria that we look at. And I don't want to read these all off to you individually, but if you have any questions about that, we can certainly talk about that offline. But what we're doing here is, I gotta back it up one. Okay, so as we look at those 6 criteria, we have a performance review built into that, and that's at the front end and at the back end. So if you're looking to apply, we look at your performance review as you're coming into the program for inclusion. And once you're already in the program, we have a periodic review. So we want to see how you're doing once you're in the program. So again, that's internal controls review, enforcement metrics, monitoring metrics, and COP review. I want to kind of expand on a couple of those areas. So think in terms of metrics. How long before, if you have a non-compliance or when a risk presents itself, how long did that go on before you noticed it, before you had your date of discovery? Which we all know that is a good example of a detective control, right? Or how long before the discovery, how long of a time did you have before you were either able to remediate or fully mitigate? Because then at that point, we're talking about corrective controls. So as we move forward, like I said, we have a lot of different metrics that we look at. And going to the next slide, you'll see that we're at full acceptance, partial acceptance, or rejection. And with each of those, we have a pretty thorough feedback mechanism for you to understand you do these things really well. And we think that your controls in this area are really strong, or perhaps you're struggling a bit more in this area and your maturity is lacking. So you'll never just get a straight up rejection from us. If you have a partial acceptance, we'll tell you why, as we will with full inclusion into the program. So right now that comes in the form of a PowerPoint presentation, which we send out to you after, but that will continue to evolve as we move forward. And I think Michael might touch on that a little bit later. I'm going to pass it off to you now.
Yeah, thank you, Sandra. Yeah, so you showed this slide before. So the self-log non-compliance submittal. When you submit this, what is in there? What's in any self-reporting? Because as I mentioned before, and I'll emphasize this a few times, a self-log non-compliance and a self-reported non-compliance submittals require the exact same information. They're almost identical forms. They might be labeled differently at the top, but we really need the same information because we've got to do the exact same thing with it. We have to make sure that it meets all the requirements, that it's going to actually prevent the recurrence of the risk to the BPS again, right? So our mission doesn't change whether it was self-logged or not, just like the TSA's mission doesn't change. Their job is to make sure that the planes, go safely and the passengers don't present a risk. Whatever changes they make in the security, it has to have that same outcome, right? So we're there too. So when it comes to us, and after it's been submitted, the first thing we have to do is look at it. And so I think, maybe the question is a lot of people have asked is, what exactly are you looking for? And we get that asked that sometimes, like, what do I need to put in that to make sure that it goes forward? And I'm sure everyone at one time has maybe received an RFI or something through the system says, hey, we read the report. We've still got a few questions we need to send in about this. When we look at that, we're looking for very specific information every single time to make sure it is complete. I call them the Magnificent Seven. Enforcement does have a number, as I steal the expression from the movie. How many people have seen the Magnificent Seven in one form or the other? Okay. So you know the story, if you've ever seen them or the Seven Samurai, it's the same either way, right? It's these seven hired guns, right? And they go to town and they protect the farmers from the bad guys outside. No matter whether you tell the story in Spanish in the 50s or with Denzel Washington or Yul Brynner or the Japanese version of it, Kurosawa's film, it's the same story. And it requires these seven elements to work. And so that's about the end of the parallel between the Magnificent Seven and ours, but I figured I'd use the expression anyway. So the number is seven, just remember that. And when you go to the next one, those seven things are the description of noncompliance, the extent of condition has to be complete, the duration, you've got to know about the risk to the BPS. I'm going to run out of hands here. Let's see, the root cause, the mitigation, and the compliance history. You need all of those things. Leave any of them out and it's not a complete story, right? I mean, if we do the Magnificent Seven and we say, oh, it's the Magnificent Six, it's a different story now. Like, we can't do that. Nobody's going to watch that movie. It's not the same movie. So when we get these things in and we look at them and you've only got six of the seven, it's got to go back the other way until the script is complete. You're telling a story, and without these seven things, it's not a complete story. So what's in those parts? So discovery, how the non-compliance was identified. Like, were you walking around, you just saw it? Like, sometimes we get things in and we just say, we just found it. Like, well, isn't that lucky? Like, I mean, did someone tell you about it or what happened there, right? So a detailed description of the non-compliance, like just saying it happened probably isn't enough. Like, just, it's a story. Tell the story. We want to hear it. The duration. You'd be amazed how many of these non-compliances we get in that we don't know if they ever ended or not. Like, that's a really big part of the story, is that it started here and it ended here, and why you determine those were the dates, The day you started the problem and the day the manager said it's no longer a problem, that's not the end date. The date the problem was fixed is the end date, right? So I wish it worked the other way and solve a lot of my problems. But the extent of condition, scope determination, including any scope expansion, or the number of affected assets, right? So if you tell us on your, you've got an LMP and you say it affected 4 units, and we don't know how many total units there were, that's not going to work. Like, we have to understand that. So that's the full story. The number of times it happened, right? We got to know that. And then any extent of condition notes. It's like your math, like when you were back in junior high and high school, if you show your work, even if you get the wrong answer, sometimes we can look at how you got to the answer and say, okay, I following you along here. The risk to the BPS. What was the risk? And like size that up for us. What is the likelihood of the impact? What was the actual impact? What was the associated reportable event? If there was one. And again, risk analysis notes, if you have them, how you went about it, who you talked to, who was involved, how you know that it was complete. What was the root cause? What was the primary effect and the reason this happened? And the reason why that's so important is because for the next one, the mitigation, we don't know if the mitigation was correct unless the root cause is complete and accurate. So without one, we can get the other. This gets back to my myth, like when somebody said we could, back in the day, there was kind of a rumor like, oh, you can just mitigate to the apparent cause. Like, well, that's not really fixing any problems, right? So the mitigation is the next big part. Without this is one of the 6th of the 7 magnificent 7. Ensure the correct actions address the root cause identified by the entity. Ensure the proposed mitigation correctly identifies all corrective actions required to prevent recurrence. It's still the same for self-logging. And then the compliance history. Now, I will say, we do the compliance history part. That's part of our analysis. There should be some awareness and some thought on this part. Has this been reported before? Is it already in mitigation? Is this our multiple? How many times have we put this into the log? There should at least be that thought process on your side of how that's going to be received on us. Because if the previous non-compliance impacts this one, the risk of it, either is it's a repeat or it's gone up or, the control caught it this time, tell us the story of how that works, and that helps us. So, as I mentioned earlier in the process, the self-log review, we're going to look for those 7 things. So when it comes through the door, an attorney is going to look at that. So it's an attorney case manager is going to look at that, or ACM as we call them in our processes. And that attorney is going to look at this. If you have a good story for those magnificent 7, and you've identified all the characters and stories and parts that we need to tell the story, it's possible the attorney can say, this is sufficient, this is all here, it's been sufficiently described, I'm going to go ahead and pass that on to management for processing as a CE and avoid the whole technical review process if it's all there. Now, it'll all, you got to tell the full story for it to be there, but if you describe all these things and tell us all that's in there, we can skip the technical review process because we can see that it's all been documented in there. That the attorney case manager at any time can say, you know what, it's better that we looked at this. Just like, again, like going through TSA pre, if you go in, the water bottle's down in your bag, or you've left something like ice cream or something down there and they're not sure what it is, they're going to pull your bag out and look through it and make sure that you don't pose a risk. If the attorney finds anything that probably doesn't add up there, or that they can't figure out, or the dates don't make sense, they'll just kick it over to an engineer and we'll take a look at it and do a full technical review. That doesn't mean it won't be accepted as a compliance exception. It just means that we're going to make sure, just like the TSA pre, if there's something that catches our eye, that we're going to give it a full review and make sure we're not passing up on something that's more serious. So I almost pushed the microphone button instead of that. I know this all, like the Magnificent Seven's new. So one of the things that we're going to do is we really haven't spent a lot of time on like how to get a better self-report in. I know there's been training on it, but we are going to expand our training for enforcement, and we're going to train, I guess, better, if you will, or offer a more comprehensive training program just now to the self-loggings, but eventually to every registered entity that will help you like generate a better self-report or a better self-logged entry. So right now we're going to do a trial in a couple of weeks with one entity, and then another trial in December with another registered entity that's part of self-logging now. We'll cover some of that tomorrow. There's a self-logging panel we're going to do here at the front of the room. But then starting next year, we're going to actually do more training. It'll be available to you on the enforcement process. So maybe you caught at the beginning of this year, we did the enforcement training series where we talked about root cause mitigation and some of those other things in the spring. That'll be expanded to a full day of training. And I'll go over the date tomorrow, but it'll be on the first day of the workshop next year, not the Tuesday, but the Monday before we get started. There'll be training at the WECC offices on how to make a great self-report. More Magnificent Seven, more Yul Brenner, more Denzel Washington. I promise, like we'll put all their pictures and make it interesting. And eventually we'll get this onto a virtual training program too. So if you can't travel to the office, because what we want to do is help you submit a better self-report. It's good for us, it's good for you. And that's really what we're trying to get at the end of the day, is to make sure that we don't, get a lot of non-compliance reports that could have been avoided either for your sake or for our sake. We're in this together. So I think at that point, Tim.
Yeah, just to connect the dots and kind of close the loop. When I was talking about full inclusion, partial inclusion, or, rejection with the application process, that I think will probably end up tying relatively closely into the onboarding process itself, right?
Yep.
So that's the part that I really like about this, is no matter the outcome, you will have feedback and you'll know the areas that you can improve in. So.
Okay. Questions? Got Leland coming up here. I was going to come in with Leland today too, but I stopped with the hair.
Thank you, Michael. I think it's somewhat of a repeat, but new information. So
Yeah.
it's a new repeat. Ron Gabi from San Diego Gas and Electric. On slide 11, you were identifying that self-logging was only eligible for minimal risk. So my question is, what is that list of attributes that WECC is considering for those minimal risks? I know, as a historic compliance professional, I understand what could be and what could be or couldn't be, but what is that subjectivity that you guys are looking at to say, look, absolutely, this is self-log qualified?
It's really, let's see if I can go back here.
11.
Is it not, is it off?
And I going to your magnificent seven, I was
Yes.
considering that we could call it the magnificent six. Maybe there's 6 attributes.
Yeah,
5.
probably could, but it just didn't work as well. So I was struggling with that, and I love Westerns too. So I was trying to find a way to get, I was trying to do the good, bad and the ugly, but that was a whole different, yeah. So what we're looking for, and there is no what is minimal risk list is that I know of. Like there's no like checklist of like, oh, sure, that's minimal. It's what's moderate and serious, right? So it's all going to be based on what the potential impact to the BPS is. And I know we 2 engineers can have 2 different opinions on what the impact could be, but we're going to look at that and try to evaluate if there was, minimal risk. And so sometimes, I will recognize, and probably many of you had this experience maybe going through with enforcement, where we come to the table and we say we have different opinions on what the risk was. And, to the best we can, we'll talk that through and listen to it and try to understand the 2 standpoints. But there's some things like, for example, if you're, if you're working in a control center and your whole control center goes down for a few hours, that's probably not going to be something we want self-logged, right? I mean, that's probably like, well, there was an event or an impact. You lost visibility into your system for hours. Like, we're going to start out at an assumption of high in those cases, right? And just try to figure out what controls you had in place that lessened the risk at the time of that. So, there's no magic checklist for what's minimal risk. But I think there's definitely lists like this that NERC has put out there that says what elevates itself to serious risk and has spent time in that area. I'm not sure if that helps you at all, or Jimmy, I don't know if you want, is that?
The Magnificent Seven helps with this too. So extent of condition should be relatively limited. The duration of the non-compliance should be fairly short. Even if it's a repeat non-compliance, if the duration is much shorter than it was the previous time, that demonstrates that you've implemented a strong detective control. We look at things like mitigation. If mitigation is going to take a long time, it's it can ramp up quickly to not being minimal risk. So, and then other things that are compensating for that risk as it's happening. So like Michael said, it's not always what is minimal risk, it's what's not minimal risk that can kind of distill and help you along the way.
Okay. And I guess what I was wanting to do, I know this is trying to be a more streamlined process than the self-report. So trying to, evaluate on our end to say, look, absolutely, this is self-log, or absolutely, this is not self-log, we'll put it in self-report. And that's, try to help you guys out
Sure.
by having that list. So maybe the significant 6 is what we call it.
Well, I'll tell you what, so as a great segue into tomorrow's presentation, we do have a panel of some entities that are in the self-logging program. That might be a great question for them of what they determine minimal risk. I will say this, is that sometimes things come in and they're not minimal risk. They just get kicked up and we change them into self-reports and we assess them. They may still wind up as compliance exceptions. That's not that's not ruled out at that point. But if it doesn't belong in the self-log, we just change it into a self-report and process it with the way of the full review. That's about the limit to it. We don't, send a letter to your boss and you wouldn't believe what he tried to pull on us. We understand that there's a different evaluation risk. Now, if you continually try to report serious things to the self-log, we do have the right, as TSA pre would, to remove you from the program if there's these egregious repeats of, well, that shouldn't be self-log. Come on, man. If you put something on there that just doesn't belong on there and we see it over and over again, I think we might do that. But just putting in something, that's, minimal risk and we disagree and we'll talk about it and we kick it up.
Okay. So if it's questionable, I'll let my boss submit it then.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's what I would do.
Yeah. All right.
Absolutely.
That's part of those back-end controls that we now have in place with our own workflow for that periodic review, whether it occurs every 6 months, 12 months, or 18 months even. One of the intentions of that is to ensure that we don't have any silos between things that are self-logged between OMP and things that are self-logged between SIP. So if we can develop any trends or if we see any shortcomings pretty consistent with your reporting, that's an opportunity for us to call you and have a discussion. And to keep with Michael's analogy, if we're consistently finding water bottles in your bag, let's talk about it and figure out where we can go from there. So.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
We did receive some questions online. First, I think this ties in nicely with Jerome's question. Are PNCs that are minimal risk to the BES but have severe violation levels per their standards tables still eligible for self-logging?
Okay, so violation severity level is always really important, and we look at that in respect to things like time horizon, the duration, that type of thing. So it's really not an all or nothing. It's understanding the facts and circumstances that would lead to minimal risk. As I mentioned before, if we're looking at controls around that were in place at your entity to help ratchet down that risk during that time period, that's really important as well. But certainly things that you want to take into consideration are the time horizon and the violation severity level.
Thank you. Is there a time limit to submit a self-log from the date of discovery?
Well, from the date of discovery, there is with the ROP for self-reporting. I don't know if Jimmy can speak to that. I don't know if that also applies to self-logging, but I would think that it does.
Is this on?
Yep.
Yeah. So ideally within 3 months is ideal, but it doesn't preclude. There's a lot of factors that we look at. So it's something's longer than 3 months. We're not going to discount it for self-logging necessarily.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jimmy. Does an audit finding disqualify you from applying for self-logging?
No.
No, but an audit finding can't be a self-log finding. So you can't log something like it's the same old thing. Once you get your audit notice letter, you can't self-log something that's within your audit scope. We'll just kick that back out to an audit finding.
Oh, okay. So I took that a different way. Is that with
Okay.
respect to the application process mainly? Does it say?
I believe this is in relation to applying for the program, not
Okay.
submitting your non-compliance.
Yeah, so you can have audit findings in your compliance history, your monitoring history, and we look at those, where those minimal risk items, that type of thing. So it doesn't immediately exclude you from from being in the self-logging program. A lot of it is how quickly did you remediate? How quickly did you mitigate? Was there an accurate extent of condition, root cause, that type of thing? So really it's how the entity was able to identify and mitigate that risk that we're looking at.
Okay. These others also appear to be application-based questions. Should I expect an RFI if I apply for the self-logging program?
Yes and no. I would say if you got an RFI, it's not worrisome necessarily, not by any means, but we're probably just looking for more information. Like I said earlier, there's 3 methodologies that we look at, and then those 6 criteria. So if we're looking for information to further support an analysis, we may send an RFI. I would say that it is fairly rare though, because we do have a lot of data on entities. And so it's possible, but for the most part, we look at the metrics and we make a determination. So
Let me just say, so just so everybody knows, we also get oversight visits. And what they would do during that oversight visits is they would look at who we admitted into the self-logging program, and they would say, pull out all your evidence and tell us why you made this decision. So we do have to defend our decisions as well through that application process. So kind of getting after that question is that we've got to defend our answers. They can't be just from the hip. Yes, sir.
If I apply for the
We got it in person here.
oh, then
Yeah.
please.
Yeah, I just want to answer a quick one. So you mentioned a bit about like self-logins, like what's the threshold? Like 1, depending on the risk level, or 2, 3, or how you kind of put like a mark there? Like this is now the second time or the third time the same event happened. So now let's talk about it. And so if you can elaborate a little bit more on that.
Do you want to go, Jimmy? The repeat violations, yeah, on the log.
Yeah, actually, a frequent violating standard, an activity standard, could really be indicative of a strong compliance program. So there is no threshold or line. It could really, typically they're usually more limited in scope, and internal controls have been added. So you still can have effective compliance program that we would continue to use self-logging to process those.
And something that we look at too is root cause. If it didn't share the same root cause,
Right.
it's not as closely tied. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me get my question back up. If I apply for the program, about how long will it take to receive a determination if I've been accepted or not into the program?
90 days.
Okay. That is it for our online questions.
Okay. Last chance in the room. All right, I guess that's time for lunch. We'll see you again tomorrow. There's a second part of the self-logging with the panel, so you get to ask more questions.
Thank you.